Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on Classroom Management Basics. This webinar is offered through the RELO Andes series of webinars. My name is Pamela Netinho. I'm the English Language Fellow at the Centro Colombo Americano in Bogota. I have many years of teaching experience in public schools in the United States. In the trainings that I've done with teachers, the subject of classroom management comes up over again. So in this hour, I'm going to give you some basic strategies and steps in order for you to implement an effective classroom management plan. So let's begin. Next slide. Okay, slide. Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on Classroom Management Basics. This webinar is offered through the RELO Andes series of webinars. My name is Pamela Netinho. I'm the English Language Fellow at the Centro Colombo. All right, can we go back one slide, please? Okay, all right. Okay, I'm going to continue and I'll just tell you, as we have a little technical glitch here. Let me just start with giving you some tips and steps to take about implementing basic classroom management strategies into your classroom. First thing I want to start with is effective teachers manage their classrooms and ineffective teachers discipline their classrooms. Effective teachers manage their classrooms because they plan ahead for everything. Before school has started, effective teachers have developed a classroom management plan, just like you develop a lesson plan or a unit plan. Effective teachers visualize what they want their classes to look like. And effective teachers know the strategies, the steps that they need to take those first few days of school. It even could actually be several weeks to establish a positive learning environment. Now, ineffective teachers have no plan. They start the year, day one, and they often think, I'll just wait, and I'm going to see what kind of students I get. And then I'll figure out what I need to do to get the students under control. That's being reactive. The teacher has no plan, and here's a warning. Once a class is out of control, it is very difficult to get the students in the class back in control. Remember, every student in your class has the right to learn without interruption from others who might disrupt the learning environment. Fred Jones is an educational psychologist, and he says that kids will try with you, the teacher, what they try with their parents. So perhaps a child manipulates his parents, or a child whines or argues with parents as they try to get their way. Students will try the same thing with you, but you've got 30 or 35 or 40 or even more than that in your classroom. So as an effective teacher, you really want to be one step ahead of the students when it comes to classroom management. And to do this, you need to create a classroom management plan and start the implementation of that plan on day one. Thank you. Okay, next screen, please. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay, can I have another slide? I'm actually one behind here, so I need, thank you. Okay, great. All right, although today's webinar is really based on everything I learned and practiced regarding classroom management over the many years that I was in the classroom, there are a few favorite books that I want to reference that are really, I think, good ones to know about. First one on the top is Tools for Teaching, and that's by Fred Jones. He includes classroom management and instructional strategies to promote student achievement. Dr. Robert Marzano is an educational researcher, and he's written numerous books on effective teaching practices. Classroom Management That Works is one of his many. And then there's The First Days of School, How to Be an Effective Teacher by Harry and Rosemary Wong. This book is one of the best-selling books for teachers of all time. I believe it has sold over 3 million copies. It's very simply written and a very easy book to reference. Next, please. Next slide. Thank you. Oops, we're one too far ahead now. Okay, we need to go back. All right. I wanted to talk about the previous slide, actually, which would say responsibilities of the effective teacher. If we can bring that one up, that is number 4. Okay, I'm just going to continue, but the slides right now aren't matching. Okay, Robert Marzano, the educational. Okay, nope, one back, please. No, we're going the wrong, okay, thank you. All right, there we are, fantastic. All right, Robert Marzano, he's the educational research. He's determined that there's really 3 big, major responsibilities of an effective teacher. The first one is making intelligent decisions about effective instructional strategies to implement in lesson design. And this pertains to the teacher choosing the right strategies and activities to meet the objective of a lesson. The next one he has is determining the sequence and pacing of the curriculum to promote student learning. This is about the teacher knowing the curriculum, knowing the students, and adjusting the curriculum to best meet the students' needs. Finally is number 3, implementing effective classroom management techniques. Today is our focus on number 3, classroom management. Because here's the truth of the matter. If there is no classroom management, if the class is in chaos, there is no learning. So number 1 and number 2 just don't happen. Next, please. A well-managed class does not just appear out of anywhere. It takes a good deal of effort to create, and the person who is most responsible for creating it is the teacher. Classroom management never goes away. Every year you've got new groups of students. Some students, they readily follow your rules and your expectations. Other students will challenge you. It is your responsibility as the teacher to teach the rules, the procedures, and the expectations of your class to the students. So let's go to next slide and look at the topics that we will be addressing today. Today we're going to be looking at getting ready before the school year begins. Most of what I share with you today is to be planned by you, the teacher, before that first day in the classroom. It's your preparation. It's your proactive steps to design what you want your class to look like. Then you teach your plan and you reinforce as needed. The next thing we're going to be looking at is establishing rules and consequences. Rules are about how students behave. Rules have consequences, and we are going to be discussing both. The next topic for today is implementing procedures and routines. Procedures are how things get done in the classroom. Procedures do not have consequences. And we're going to look at a few procedures to consider in building structure in your classroom. Building a community of learners. We'll look at ideas for you to build support and success for students. And finally, today, we are going to look at some classroom management styles. And we're going to go through descriptors of each style. So let's get started. Next slide, please. FEAT, a classroom management tool that you need. Okay, now this may seem a little silly, but a teacher should never be sitting during class. The teacher must be up and moving around. You've got to be literally on your feet. which this actually is the very first step in your classroom management. Next slide, please. Okay, let's look at the concept of zones of proximity. This is an extremely effective tool to manage in your classes. Fred Jones mentions it in Tools for Teaching if you wanted more information, but this concept of proximity has been around for decades. Please take a look at the diagram. Okay, you're the teacher, and you are in the middle of the red circle. Okay. There are students sitting around you who are also in that red circle. This red zone is about 8 feet or 2.5 meters around you. Okay, so imagine you're in the middle and you have students around you. Okay, research shows that students sitting in this red zone, because they're close to you, will show very few discipline problems. You're near, the students know that you are nearby, so they stay on task. Okay. Now, you're still in the middle of that red circle. Okay. But there are students sitting now in a yellow zone. Okay, you're moving out as your class. This yellow zone is about 6 feet or 2 meters beyond the red zone. So basically, students in the red zone and the yellow zones are no more than 14 feet or 4 meters away from you, the teacher. Most students sitting in that yellow zone will behave as they would if they were in the red zone, because they know the teacher is still fairly close by. Then there's the green zone. Okay, this is the danger zone, because green is the goof-off zone. The students in the green zone are sitting far away from you, and you probably cannot easily see them unless you've got a very small class. So the green zone is where students are most likely to be talking, fooling around, disruptive, and just generally off task. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at this classroom, okay? I hope you can see it, all right? You've got a classroom, and you can see the circles, all right? The teacher is the star in the middle of the red circle. You see the desks in the red zone. You can see the desks in the yellow zone. And the green zone is mostly those desks on the left of your screen. Now remember, when the students are at their seat, they're not going to move, but you are. You want to walk, that is, move, around the classroom as much as possible during class time to get every student in that red zone for at least part of the class. Remember, as you, the teacher, move around the room, the zones change. Next slide, please. Okay, in this picture, in this particular image, the students are literally red, yellow, and green. And if you look in the top right-hand corner, it appears that the 2 students in the green zone are off task. But it looks as if the teacher sees them talking. The teacher needs to excuse himself from the student in red and slowly move toward the off-task students, those now in green. The teacher must move to get those 2 into the red zone. Remember, the zones change as the teacher moves, even though the students are sitting in the same place. Simply by getting those 2 into the red zone, their actions may stop without any comment or reprimand from the teacher. That is the goal. Simply by having the teacher move around the room, continually creating these different zones, the off-task behaviors stop or they're reduced. It's like, here comes the teacher, we need to stop talking. In too many classrooms, the teacher stays in the front, and those in the green zone just talk and talk and talk, and the teacher does nothing. Instead, without stopping instruction, move to the students who are talking. Talking should stop without you saying anything. If not, then quietly give them a warning and tell the students to stop the talking and get back on task. Statistically and generally, about 80 to 85% of your students will not be behavior problems beyond talking. But talking is the biggest problem in most classrooms. Never ignore talking. You must move to stop it, or move and reprimand to stop it, because ignored talking becomes contagious. If you don't do anything, students will see that you don't care and you don't follow through. And so what happens is they just join in with the ones who are talking because they don't think you're going to ask them to stop. Here's some additional statistics. 10 to 15% of students have behavior challenges. But with good classroom structure and the support of the teacher, these students can succeed in your classroom. Then you even have more difficult students. There's about an estimate of about 5 to 7% of students who have severe behavioral problems. These are students who might be depressed. They may have anger management issues. They may be oppositional defiant. They may have psychological issues. And for these students, teachers often need extra help. Maybe they need counselors, there's a nurse, perhaps administrators, just whoever deals and can support you at your school for those students. Next slide, please. Okay, to implement proximity, you need mobility. Remember, with proximity, you want to continually move to get students in and out of the 3 zones of proximity. So you've got to arrange the seating in your room so you can move. Okay, this is one seating idea. This one's by Fred Jones. It's called the interior loop. And the desks are actually in pairs. There is a section with 4 students, but those are even also grouped in pairs and pairs, 2 pairs in the center. Notice the red path. The red path that's kind of what you want to create. You want to create a path in your room so you could easily move around the room and get to all the students. Good mobility equals good proximity. Next slide, please. This is another one called the double E. This is another arrangement. The image on the left has tables with 2 students at each table. On the right, the students are in desks, but you can see the path. In this classroom, in this arrangement, the teacher could easily walk and talk and instruct at the same time. Next slide, please. You can also have seating in groups. Notice the teacher's desk is in the front of the room. Sometimes a teacher's desk can act as a barrier, and teachers don't move from that desk to implement proximity. But in this room, you can see there is a red path indicating where the teacher could move during instruction to get to different students, thereby creating different zones of proximity during class time. Zones of proximity are going on continuously as the teacher moves. Every classroom is different. Play around with the best arrangement for your room. Just make sure there's a path so that you can move. Now, if you move from room to room, and I know for many of you, you don't have your own classroom, you're moving from different rooms for different classes. What you need to do is to show the students how you want the desks to be arranged and train them to arrange the desks at the beginning of class. This actually is going to become a procedure, this arranging the desk procedures, and we'll be talking about procedures a little bit later. Next, please. Remember, school hasn't started yet. We're still getting ready for that first day of school. So at the beginning of the school year, you must teach rules. Rules describe how students are to behave or act in the classroom. Rules have consequences. Procedures describe how things are done in the classroom. And finally, routines. Routines are what the students do automatically. Procedures, with practice, become routines. And when you've got routines in your classroom, you've got structure. Okay, now we're going to look at each one of these elements of that structure. Next slide, please. Okay, rules, remember, equal behavior. Let's look at what the focus would be if you are teaching in the primary grades. Basically, in the primary grades, rules will focus on politeness and helpfulness when dealing with others, respecting the property of others, interrupting the teacher or others, hitting or shoving others. Remember, these are your young students. They haven't been in school very long. They're new to school. They're new to the socialization of school. Okay, next slide. Okay, these are actually examples of rules you could have in a primary classroom. Now, there's kind of a contradiction here. Generally, I say don't have more than 5 rules. Here's an exception. There's 6. However, it looks like the teacher wants to use the senses as a way to teach the rules to the children in her classroom. What you can actually do is just do a Google search and search classroom rules, and you will find many examples to choose from that you can then select for the 5 in your classroom. Okay, but remember, on your first day of school, you must explain these rules. So maybe this teacher, this primary teacher, would go over the rules first verbally. Maybe she wants the students to do a little choral reading, to have them also read the rules. And then maybe she wants the students, remember this is primary, she wants them to draw the rules. So she might ask the students to draw. What does I see people are being nice look like? What does I see people are helping each other look like? The teacher could put the students into 6 different groups and assign each group a rule to draw. Perhaps the teacher would have the students divide the paper into 6 sections, write each rule in a section, and then have the students draw their idea of what people are being nice looks like, people are helping each other, people are happy, and so on. Okay. On day 1, you need to create a lesson plan to give students the rules and to explain those rules. Next slide, please. Okay, again, this is more rules is behavior and the focus in the secondary classroom. Little different. In the secondary classroom, you're focusing more on bringing materials to class, being in the assigned seat at the start of class, respecting and being polite to others, respecting other people's property, talking or not talking, and remember that's a big one for many secondary students, is that excessive talking, and then leaving the assigned seat. So let's take a look at possible secondary rules. Next, please. Okay, here are 5 rules. Limit your rules to 5. Perhaps this vocabulary would be too difficult for your students, so simplify. If you have your own classroom, then the rules should be posted somewhere in the front of the classroom in large print so they can be easily seen. Now, if you travel from one classroom to another, have students write the 5 rules on page 1 of their notebooks. So they have the rules with them, and you can review and refer to page 1 in their notebooks when you need to review any rules as needed. Remember, your day 1 lesson plan will state the rules and explain the rules, and you will review as needed. It may take reminders for the first few days, maybe even the first few weeks, until students understand and follow your rules. Next slide. Here's another example. These would be secondary rules, okay? And here's another possible list you could use. And I want you to focus on number 5, because I'm just going to talk a little bit about that one. Number 5 is actually a rule that I had in my classroom as a secondary teacher. And you might say, use appropriate language in your speech and writing. And you'd probably say, oh my goodness, that is so vague. So, to explain this rule to my students, I taught them language registers. Language registers is a part of linguistics, and it deals, and I'm going to just simplify this, it deals with the appropriateness of language in social versus work or business situations. Every language has language registers. And so what I would do, the first day of school, to explain rule number 5, I would put notes on the board, and I'd have the students copy the description of each register. Then we'd go through with a lot of examples for each register. I'd write the examples down, and the students would copy these examples into their notebooks. The students would become very aware of what words were inappropriate for the classroom, and because really the classroom is a student workplace, and which words were not appropriate. For example, I did not allow my students to ask me, "Hey, what's up, teacher?" Okay, that is slang. That is casual language or informal register. That's the kind of words that you use with a peer. And I would actually give the students a definition of peer. A peer, P-E-E-R, is someone who is approximately the same age as you. And I told students, I am not your peer. I am not your friend or buddy. Now that kind of shocked them. Okay, I am your teacher, and school is your workplace. So you must speak using the consultative register. Although it was the first or second day of school, we did a lot of examples also about formal register. Formal register is the register of academic writing. And as my students would be expected to write essays throughout the year, I wanted to realize the kind of word usage that they would have to use in their essays. Next slide, please. Next, please. Okay. Finding. Rules and procedures should not simply be imposed on students. Rather, the proper design of rules and procedures involves explanation and input. Now, to me, this statement has a couple of options. First, as a teacher, I created my 5 rules for my classroom. However, some educators propose that students in each class should discuss and mutually agree on the 5 rules for their class. Essentially, every class would have its own set of 5 rules. Okay. In reality, I used that approach once. I was teaching in a summer school program, and I only had 2 classes. So each class developed their own set of 5 rules, and I posted them, and it worked for 2 classes. However, during this regular school year, I often had 5 or 6 classes. And to be blunt, I could not remember which set of rules went with which class. And I like to memorize my rules so I can quickly reference them and reteach them if I need to. So I've always created my 5 rules. But I always did a thorough job of explaining the rules at the very beginning of the school year. So whichever approach you decide upon, it's up to you. But you need class rules that are taught and explained to students at the beginning of the school year. Next slide, please. Okay. Rules have consequences. When a rule is not followed, there's a consequence. So you need to teach students that every action results in a consequence, positive or negative. Consequences are not punishments. Consequences are the result of a person's chosen action. So again, we're at before school. You need to think, what will be the consequence or consequences for not following a rule? Maybe you decide your first step is a verbal warning to the student. And then the same day you need to give a second warning. So that at that point you either give the second warning or you go up to the student and you say, I need to see you briefly after class. You just have a little conference with the student. It can be 30 seconds. Maybe if there's still a problem in that same class, you decide that you need to make a phone call home to parents. Whatever you decide as your consequences, they must be doable for your teaching situation. You must be able to do the consequence. Let's say you're teaching in an environment where you know the students have jobs after school, and they have these jobs because they help to support their family. Then giving them a consequence like staying after school is unrealistic. And in my opinion, that's pretty downright mean on the teacher's part. You also need to find out about the school's policy for the behavior of students. Do administrators support the teachers in classroom management at your school, or are you pretty much on your own? I hope you have the support of administrators at your school. You should. Maintaining school safety is a part of administrators' job. There are schools that have a hierarchy of consequences for use by both teachers and administrators. And let's take a look at a hierarchy of consequences. Next slide, please. Okay, here's an example of a hierarchy of consequences. And you can see the level of the infraction. The specific student's infraction, and in the third column, a possible teacher intervention. Many schools create these charts so that teachers cannot send the student out of the room for a minor infraction. So let's look at the chart. For example, the consequence for throwing paper is not writing a behavior contract. Okay, that's an intervention for a severe infraction. Referencing this chart, the teacher is really responsible for consequences at the minor level and the moderate level. Any teacher who is sending students out of the classroom for a minor infraction like talking out is sending a message to administrators. You're basically telling administrators, I can't handle my students. I never implemented a classroom management plan. In the United States, the lack of classroom management is the #1 reason for beginning teachers to not be rehired for the next school year. You can design creative lessons, but if your classroom is chaotic and no one is listening and no one is paying attention, then there's little to no learning. Next slide, please. Procedures and routines are the key to a well-managed classroom. Effective classroom teachers spend more of their time in the first few weeks of school teaching classroom rules, procedures, and routines as opposed to academic content. And this is one of the beliefs of Harry and Rosemary Wong. Harry Wong is a huge proponent of procedures. He feels that procedures are actually more important than rules. That if you teach students how things are done in the classroom, then they know what to expect. And then behavior naturally improves. Again, all this planning, the seating, the rules, the consequences, and now procedures, these are all determined by you, the teacher, before you walk into the classroom on the first day. The implementation plan starts on day 1. Next, please. So let's look at procedures. Procedures are how things get done. All right, so let's look at the first one. It says starting class, do now. I'm going to explain this one with a more specific example because I really believe in having a do now activity right at the beginning of class. A do now, and I always wrote on my board, do now, is a 5 to 7 minute individual activity that starts class every day. The do now is a review of a skill or some content that the students learned a day or two earlier. The do now is to be at the independent level. Again, it's a review. Each student works alone, writing the work and the answers in their notebook. It might be 5 sentences where you're using the close procedure. It might be matching or writing definitions to recently introduced vocabulary. Maybe you have a textbook and there was a short exercise in the text that the students never did. So have them do that exercise that you did not do as a review. The do now allows students to settle in and get started to work immediately. It allows you, the teacher, time to gather your materials and to take attendance. In other words, you kind of settle in. The do now should be quickly checked together. Remember, it is a review. The whole do now activity should be no more than the first 10, 15 minutes of class. Then the instructional lesson for your day begins. Another procedure might be posting. Where do you post your class or day schedule? What's going to be your procedure for students to leave the room to use the bathroom or get drinks? What about a signal to get students' attention? Don't overuse your voice. It's bad for you, and your students often tune out. What's going to be your procedure when students need paper or pencil? What do you do? How do students ask for help in your room? Do they raise your hand, or are they supposed to ask a partner first? What about working in groups? Are you going to have a procedure for keeping their voices, what I call short voice, long voice? Short voice is for a group, and long voice is when you want to be heard in the entire room. What about passing in papers or notebooks? How will you collect student work? What about class dismissal? Remember, you dismiss the class, not the bell. And there's a lot more procedures. And I want to give you a hint on this. If you Google Procedures and Routines by Harry Wong, it is a document. You will find a list. He has included about 70 procedures. In this list, Harry Wong, who's such a proponent of procedures, he lists all these procedures that you might possibly consider to implement and practice in your classroom. Some are very geared to elementary school, and some are very geared to the secondary classroom. But if you take a look at that list, again, Procedures and Routines by Harry Wong, you could look at that list and then pick and choose, what do I need in my classroom? Procedures must be established in the beginning of the classroom, at the beginning of the year. And just like rules, you have to teach them in order to implement them. You may have to teach and reteach the first few days, possibly even the first few weeks of school, until those procedures become routines. Next slide, please. Now, one of the procedures was, how are you going to get students' attention? And actually, it's hard for me to show here, but these are, I've always used bells and chimes and so on in my classroom. And what you see in front of you, I found these in a market in Colombia. And I've been using these when teaching students, or even during my training for teachers. If teachers are doing a think, pair, share activity and they're talking with their partner, but I want the activity to come to a close and I want to get their attention, I use a noisemaker. So I've got a few. This is the one on the left, and when I put it in my hand, it stops. This is the one in the middle. Okay. And then I also have this one. Okay, you want to find something to get students' attention other than your voice. You want to find something that you use so you're not talking over the students, because you're going to hurt your voice over time. And if you've got classes of 40, 45, or 50, you are really exerting, overusing your voice. But a sound, a noisemaker, it startles people. It's different than your voice, and it gets people back on task. Next slide, please. Okay, now you have a procedure, and you need to teach that procedure. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is you want to explain to the students what you want them, what the procedure is. So you state what you want. Remember, procedures are how things are done. You state what you want, and you explain, you model, and you demonstrate the procedure. So I would explain to students, I'm going to do this with the noisemaker. Okay, here's my first step. And I'm going to talk to you as if I would talk to my students. So with students, I would explain, this year you'll often be working in pairs with a partner, or you're going to be in groups. And I don't want to yell. And you don't want to hear me yell. And I don't want to hurt my voice. So I have this, and I show them my noisemaker. When you hear this noise, you need to stop talking and listen. Now we're going to rehearse. And I'm going to rehearse and practice the procedure under, that's your supervision, under the teacher's supervision. So again, I'm going to talk as if I'm talking to the students. All right. Okay, everybody, let's try this. Would you turn to the person next to you and say hello and introduce yourself? Now, I let the class get really noisy. I allow 3, 4, 5 seconds for the students to quiet down. The smaller your class, the less time it takes. If you've got 40, 45, it might take 5 seconds for them to quiet down. All right, they've quieted down. Thank you. Well done. Let's try it again. We're still rehearsing. Will the other person say hello and introduce yourself? Again, I let the class get noisy. Okay. Thank you. Very nicely done. All right, I've taught a procedure. Now what's going to happen is the third stage is reinforce. I may have to tomorrow in the class reteach, rehearse, and practice. I have to tell you one thing though, with the noisemaker, they get it really, really quickly. And it's a very easy procedure to implement. Next slide, please. Next, please. Next, please. Okay, thank you. Procedures with practice become routines. So my students just knew the noisemaker, not my voice, meant to stop talking. Routines provide structure for students. Students know what to expect in your class. And when you have procedures down and they've become routines, it is definitely a hooray moment. So teaching and reteaching rules, consequences, procedures, which become routines, can become very time-consuming at the beginning of the year. But all the time and effort will pay off when students know the routine of your class and the expectations for behavior. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, the next topic we were going to look at was build a community of learners, and this is very much your responsibility as a teacher. So how will you build community? Next slide. There are two things that you need to think about. You want to have community. You're going to be with these students months, perhaps 10 months, the entire school year. So you want to have the students care for each other, and then you want to get to know your students as well. So the first thing you want to do is you want to build community within your classroom. You want the students to get to know each other. So in those lesson plans that you're doing those first few days about rules and procedures, you also need to include a few get-to-know activities for your students. You can check on websites for ideas for get-to-know activities, ask other colleagues. Here's a couple of examples. One example you could have students do one day is find someone who, and you maybe put on the list board, find someone who has been to Cartagena, find someone who has, been in an airplane, whatever you want. You put questions and they write down the names and go around the classroom getting students. There's also a concept called 2 truths and a lie. Another activity is just get the names of animals and put them on pieces of paper. Put the names of the animals on the backs of students so they can't see the name. Have them walk around the room and ask questions to other students. Preferably, they should be questions that have just yes or no answers, and they keep walking around and asking questions of each other until they identify their animal. Okay. For homework, as a get-to-know, you could ask the students to bring in 3, 4, 5 items that they are willing to share with others and explain to others how that item is important or special to them. You could then the next day have students share in groups of 6 or 8. I would do fairly large groups because remember it is a get-to-know activity. Next, what you want to do is you must build a relationship with your students. To begin, you must learn students' names as quickly as possible. Get that seating arrangement. Put students in assigned seats. Make a seating chart. Refer to that chart to get to know students' names. Get to know their interests, their likes, maybe a little bit about their personal lives. Consider having a student write a letter to you introducing themselves. Maybe you could have questions on the board so they would know that you might want included. You might want to include the following question: how can I help you to learn and succeed in this class? When you write that question, how can I help you to learn and succeed in this class? Some answers will be very enlightening. I had a student write to me that he needed glasses, but his parents couldn't afford them. So that told me he needs to sit in the front of the room. Another student told me that he was deaf in his right ear. Again, that made a difference as to where I sat him in the classroom. And when you make the effort to build a relationship with your students, they immediately know that you care and that you want them to succeed. Next slide, please. Okay, what are some ways that teachers show you respect? This question was asked to 980 middle school students in Chicago, Illinois. Approximately 63% of the students received free or reduced price lunch. And basically this is an indicator that tells you that the students are from low income families. So let's look at the results. Next slide, please. Okay. The top 12 answers were written by 50 students or more. Okay, first, so how do teachers show respect to their students? Talk sincerely, no sarcasm or eye rolling. Sarcasm only builds resentment. Return evaluated work promptly. Grade their work. Develop and use rubrics to evaluate student work. If students see and understand the rubric ahead of time, then they know what they need to do to meet the standards set in the rubric. Be available during non-classroom times. Sometimes students just want to talk to you privately. Use students' names when talking to him or her. There it is. There it is again. You must learn students' names. Let students or guardians know the student did a good job sometimes. So these, even though they're in middle school and they're starting to separate from their parents, they want you to tell the parents once in a while that they're doing a good job. Number 7, prepare exciting lessons. This is a huge part of classroom management. You must design interesting and student-centered lessons. If students are bored, believe me, they will create their own excitement in class, and you will have many disruptive behaviors. You've got to think of it as a huge compliment when a student says, "Is class over already?" Well, what happened was the student was so engaged that time just seemed to fly by. Let's continue. Next slide, please. Number 6, and remember this, how does a teacher show respect to students? Display student work around the classroom and or the school. Remember, when you post work, you are praising students and you are demonstrating high quality work to others. Have a sense of humor. It's okay to let your feelings show, just do it in a positive way. Listen without interrupting. Talk less. Design lessons so the students talk more. Respect personal space. Don't grab, touch, grab, eyeball, crowd, etc. And number 2, use a calm tone of voice, even when upset. No yelling. Remember, you will use proximity as a strategy to implement discipline. If all students are working and you yell across the room to a student, you have disrupted your own class. So you don't want to go there. Use instead proximity. And the number one way that, next slide please, the number one way that teacher shows respect to students, talk privately to a student when a problem occurs. Use proximity. Use mobility. A quiet reminder or reprimand, that's what you need. Remember, you are to stay in control at all times. Next slide. Okay, the last topic that we're going to really look at is classroom management styles. So let's take a look at the 4 different classroom management styles. Normally in my trainings, I give participants a survey to complete, and then from that, they learn their own primary style. What I'm going to do today is just go over some descriptors for each style. But I want you to think right now, what style do you think you are? Okay, let's take a look at the one on the left, authoritarian style, the authoritarian style. The authoritarian teacher puts firm limits and controls on students. The teacher imposes strict discipline and expects obedience from students. Students learn they need to follow directions and not ask why. This classroom is quiet. The authoritarian teacher's main instructional strategy is lecture. The teacher makes all the decisions. Students often describe this teacher as being unfair. At the opposite extreme is the permissive teacher, and this teacher places few demands or controls on students. This teacher actually has difficulty saying no to students, and therefore they may have class rules, but they don't enforce the class rules. Discipline is actually very inconsistent in the permissive teacher's classroom. And here's why. The teacher doesn't want to hurt the student's feelings. In fact, the permissive teacher really wants to be the student's friend. This permissive teacher may even encourage contact outside of the classroom. And this person really has trouble separating his professional life from his personal life. Now, students often like this teacher. And the permissive teacher is often a very popular teacher. But eventually, the students learn that the class is out of control and that they're not learning anything. At the bottom, you see the detached or indifferent teacher. And the detached or indifferent teacher is not involved in the classroom. This teacher places few demands on students and generally appears disinterested in the class and not very interested in the students. This teacher often feels that class preparation is not worth the time or the effort. And so the detached teacher often uses the same lesson plans and the same materials year after year after year. And the students quickly realize that the teacher has a lack of caring, both in instruction and for them. What happens eventually is that the students just turn off to learning because they realize the teacher doesn't care either. Now let's look at the last style, and the one on the top where it says assertive or authoritative. And the assertive or authoritative teacher places limits and controls on students, but at the same time encourages independence. This teacher explains the reasons behind rules and decisions. And if a student is disruptive, this teacher explains the reason why they made an error, why they need a reprimand, but that reprimand is given in a very firm but polite way. The classroom environment in the assertive teacher's classroom allows the students the opportunity to practice communication skills. And the assertive teacher often gives students praise and encouragement. And this is really a classroom that fosters motivation. Students like this teacher. To students, the assertive teacher is fair, and fairness is very, very important to students. And I think it's rather obvious that the assertive or authoritative style is really the guide. That's the one you really want to aim for on your path to becoming a highly effective teacher. Next slide, please. Okay, and just to conclude on a final note, consistency. Students appreciate consistency. Once students have internalized classroom rules, procedures, and routines, the day will run much more smoothly. I hope that you have learned the basics in developing your classroom management plan, or if you've already had a plan in place, which I hope you have, I hope you have learned today some additional strategies that you can add to the plan that is now in existence. And I want just to remember one thing. Classroom management never goes away, but it does get easier over time. Before I leave you, can we go to the next slide, please? I have here a few helpful websites. I've reiterated Procedures and Routines Checklist by Harry Wong. It's actually a document. I suggest signing up, if you can, to Smart Classroom Management. You can actually sign up to this website and you will get an email about once a week, and it will have a sample scenario. I often in trainings where I have more time do scenarios with my participants, and they will give you a scenario of a student behavior and what to do in that situation and what not to do. And then the last one is Education World. So at this point I will see if there are any questions. Okay, so I don't know if we have, let's see if we have any questions. Perhaps we don't. Okay. Okay, it looks like we may not have any questions today. Oh gosh, I hope I gave you some good ideas. Maybe I answered all your questions in the webinar. Okay. All right, then. I think time is just about up. If we don't have any questions, then I hope you learned something. I hope you have some strategies to put in place. And thank you for joining me. Oh, we do have a question here from Lima. What is the most important arrangement of your classroom? I don't think there's most important. If we're talking about desk arrangement here, if you're talking about desk arrangement, you really need to look at your room. Personally, I always started my students sitting with a partner. So my desks were very, very much like the first one you saw, where the students were in pairs, and I had my classroom in rows, and the students were in pairs. And then my students would move into groups as needed. But you need to look at your classroom. You may have a long and narrow classroom. You may have a very wide classroom that is not as deep. But I always like to have students sitting in pairs because I always like to promote, I do a lot of student-centered strategies, and I want my students to be able to work with a partner. Okay. Teens generally have their own group of friends. When school starts, they may not seem willing to make new friends. I want to get to avoid rejection. Please suggest some techniques. Okay, yes, students by teenage years, they all have their own friends, but you don't want cliques within your classroom. So you need to, what you want is yes, they may not be friends with that particular person outside the classroom, but there is consideration and respect for other students in the classroom, even though they are not your friend. So that is why it is your job to implement. And I used to do probably 3 or 4 get acquainted activities, get to know activities over several days of class so students get to know each other. So I would say for that one, go back to your get to know activities. So at least they have about respect too. And your rules. Look about respect, students having respect for each other. What if a student misbehaves? Should I stop my class? Okay, if a student misbehaves, then you're going back to proximity. There's a term, and I didn't get to it today, called with-itness. And it's the idea that a teacher knows what's going on in all parts of his or her classroom. So if a student becomes disruptive, you want to move towards that student, perhaps even before talking to him. The goal, the objective of moving is hopefully he'll say, oops, the teacher's coming, the teacher is near, I need to stop. And he will self-control and manage his own behavior. Okay. I don't think we have any more questions. Thank you very, very much for joining me.